This didn't happen too recently, but actually happened last summer when my wife and I, kids, and wife's cousin's family decided to do a joint impromptu trip to the beach. We booked an Airbnb condo about 3 minutes away from beach access. It was going to be wonderful. I want to state that what happened during this trip didn't really hinder our experiences much, as it just kind of made us wonder, what the hell is really going on? The day we're supposed to leave, we get all packed up and ready to hit the road. We're actually about a good 4 hours away from this beach, so it took us quite a drive. By the time we get near where we're supposed to check in at, it's already getting dusky outside. For those who are curious as to what town this took place in, this was in Seaside, Oregon. I'm sure many of your listeners might be familiar with that town. It is one of the most popular beaches on the West Coast. There's a small town north of Seaside known as Gerhardt. I don't know anything about the specifics of that town, like how big it is, population, etc. I only know that it sits north. This is important because this is where the sighting took place. Seaside and Gerhardt have one mighty highway that travels all along with it. Highway 101. I believe Highway 101 is the main highway that rides all along the entire West Coast through many beach towns, but I could be wrong. Anyway, we're traveling north on this road, and we have to make a left turn onto Gerhardt Road, which, after a short distance, opens up into this massive golf course on both sides of the road. The road then turns to the left, and there sits the main office building to check in at. I forget the name of the place we stayed at, so forgive me. I can only remember distinctive buildings. Again, surrounded by a massive golf course with only a few trees on the side of the road, so you can see everything pretty clearly. We're just starting to approach the section of the road that has the golf course, and my family and I are amazed to see that there are literally hundreds of wild elk everywhere. I've never seen so many elk in my life. I wish I would have stopped to take a picture. There were some bulls among the giant herd, but it looked to be mostly all cows. As we're coming to the turn in the road and astonished at all the elk everywhere, my wife notices something off in the distance of the golf course. Now, before I go further, right as you enter this area of the road, there's a thick layer of woods between Highway 101 and this left turn in the road, followed by the golf course. And this layer of woods is this large creek/river that runs through. I have no idea what it's called. My wife notices several, I'm talking maybe 10 plus elk running for their life for the rest of the herd as this giant black dog-shaped thing chases after them. I couldn't really look too well because I'm driving, but I do see it. My wife starts freaking out, asking me what the hell is that and if I see it. It was far away, but it was easily as big as the elk were, if not taller, and chasing them on what appeared to be two legs. It was fast. We only watched it for maybe 5 seconds before we arrived at the office to check in. Where the parking lot is, which is smaller, you can't see over a small hill in the distance. I run out of the car to run in and check in to our condo. My wife is acting nervous and still freaking out a little at what just transpired. I really wasn't sure to make of it, but it wasn't bothering me as much. I came out a few minutes later. Wife was still nervous, but didn't see anything, even though we were right by the elk by the parking lot. We turned around and drove out the parking lot and to our condo, which was down the road and away from the golf course. Didn't end up seeing it after that. We actually ended up forgetting all about it, to be honest. The next day, we planned all sorts of activities to do with the kids at the beach, so we loaded back up in our car and back out the way we came, by the road with the golf course. I believe was still Gerhardt Road, and it's the only way to our knowledge to get to Highway 101 from our condo. As we're driving back through it, the following morning, having completely forgot about the prior evening, there were cops all over the place. No signs of elk anywhere, but We counted 5 cruisers and multiple officers with shotguns, what looked to be weapons and automatic rifles. They were pointing out to the woods. Some looked like they were scouting the area, while others were on call. I had no idea what the hell was going on, but my wife and I thought maybe there might have been an escaped convict or something crazy. What else would warrant all those officers on the scene of that golf course? If I had to guess, there were at least 7 or 8 that were heavily armed. I truly don't know because I really didn't count. If what we saw the night before had anything at all to do with the officers being there, then it was super weird. When we returned later on that night to come back to the condo for the day, they were gone, so I truly don't know what happened. When we had the initial sighting, there were multiple cars parked in the parking lot and another car or 2 driving on the road we were on. I don't know if they saw what we did, but nobody seemed to be paying attention or even making it a big deal. Hell, I don't even know for sure that is what we saw. I don't think I really gave it much thought until I discovered something called Dogman after listening to your podcast episodes. I can't guarantee that's what it is, but the descriptions of what I saw closely match your witness descriptions. I am the manager of the Visitor Center at Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. During the winter of 2001 to 2002, my family and I were the camp hosts at the park and lived in the park full time. One evening in mid-December of 2001, I and my 2 children, ages 11 and 10, were in our travel trailer reading when we heard a sound that made us cower. It was something between a human cat call and a cow mooing, a kind of "ah-oo" that just echoed through the woods. I have served as a naturalist for the California State Park System. I have hiked the woods of California all my life, and I have never heard anything like this before. I have heard bear, mountain lion, and elk, and this was nothing like those. What impressed us was most is how loud it was. We have heard groups of humans in the campground hooping and hollering, and their noise level was not even close to this. We were inside of a travel trailer that had windows closed up, and the noise was clear and strong. We estimated that it had to have come just across the Smith River from the campground. I decided to make this report after hearing what seemed to be the same kind of sound on a recent rerun of sightings. Back in the late 1980s, I helped manage and run a bar outside of a small town in West Virginia. I won't say the name because I don't want my name tied to it in any way. If I revealed the name or location of this establishment, I would be tied to this thing so fast. I can't risk my reputation. But I will say that I've had plenty of experiences, along with several customers with an unknown hyena canine cross. I don't think there's a simpler way to put it. It was terrifying, and this animal, I'll call it, appeared very aggressive. It never attacked me or caused me any personal harm, but it has attacked other vehicles, parts of the buildings, and even other customers. I've had crew chased out of the property late at night. There was a really bad attack that happened in the early spring one year. A customer almost got his arm bitten off entirely. Lots of blood. No police involvement though, which was more than weird. These animals had broken windshields, damaged vehicles, pulled off tires of cars to the point of where they are severely damaging the axle. You name it. We've fired all kinds of guns and weapons at them, but nothing really seemed to hurt these things. Only keep them at bay and chase them off into the night. Let me give you some of the finer details. So, I co-managed this bar with a friend of mine for around 4 years of business, and it was great. We had a lot of regulars, but I will always remember around spring and fall time, we would start experiencing strange things around the outside. Our bar didn't have a whole lot of people and neighborhoods or other businesses around. We were kind of out of the way, tucked outside of town, surrounded by one road with lots of timber and woods all around. It was common that we'd get animals here and there that would wander onto the property, but not like what we would experience. We would hear strange noises we could never quite explain. The shifting shadows, you feel like you're being watched. Some of the first events when we had a customer come in shortly after, leaving one evening, complaining that some large dog just ripped the bumper off his car while he was exiting the parking lot. I wanted to know if anybody owned a dog, and of course, none of us did. Staff would report seeing and hearing noises just beyond the light of outside lights of the bar, all while people having their windows smashed and cars left without mirrors and minor claw marks. That, of course, is just how things started off. We encourage our employees to bring weapons and store them safely in their car, just in case they felt threatened. We did hear gunshots go off sometimes, and during the fall and spring, it wasn't uncommon for employees to call in for work because they were scared. We had many waitresses and cooks come and go for this very reason. We were not sure what to make of it because no one had really seen what animal was doing this. Some employees quit the same night, saying some large hyena black animal had chased them in their car, while others talked about getting in their car and this strange, hideous creature pressing its face against the driver's side window, trying to open the door. It became a severe enough problem again and would die down again in the winter and summer months, and we wouldn't really have this many issues. I knew a lot of the issues and would pop up in spring, but I didn't have a first-hand account with it until the following fall. I was walking out to my car one night, going to exit when this tall-looking creature, covered in shaggy black hair, steps out from behind the side of the bar and starts to quickly walk in my direction. The second I saw it, I had mixed emotions of confusion and terror as I sprinted to my car and got in and out as quickly as I could. As soon as I made it to my car, not only was this creature still following me, but it had picked up its pace towards my vehicle, and its entire demeanor went from calm to very aggressive. I wasn't carrying any weapons on me at this time. It was a couple weeks later that a customer was leaving the bar at night, just like I had, and was supposedly attacked so bad that his arm was almost torn off entirely. We never saw him again because he never returned, and like I said earlier, police did show up and take statements, but they never returned for a follow-up investigation. In fact, we were blown off by the police when we called and asked for help the first few times that spring, so we just assumed we were on our own. They did not have the manpower to do a proper investigation and stop whatever this animal was. The thing is, nobody really talked about what it was. Everybody just thought it was a bunch of wild coyotes or wolves or maybe a bear. It wasn't until customers and employees started seeing these things that they began to be widespread panic and fear. It crippled business for some time because it got so bad. At the time, we didn't have any sort of surveillance of any sort. I wish we did, because we could have had clear footage of these things. Multiples of them would hang around at nighttime, run across the parking lot, and just cause havoc. Everyone I talked to, or who had told me about their experience with these things, all lined up to the same basic description of what I saw. Hyena, wolf-looking creatures, very tall and shaggy, lots of black hair, walking on two legs, huge claws, very ugly and deformed looking. These things would try and attack my staff and customers on a nightly basis, but never really do anything serious, or I should say serious harm. Many times they were shot at, but all it did was scare them off, and they would flee. None were ever killed to my knowledge, or that I knew about. I knew the word werewolf had been thrown around a few times, but I never took that seriously, because I know werewolves don't exist. These things were something else different entirely, in my opinion, even though they did have similar appearances. They weren't the violent eating and killing people like how Hollywood would portray them to be if they were indeed werewolves. An interesting thing I learned about 10 years after I left the managing position is that place, well, that entire area, about 150 years prior to development, was actually a part of a large Indian burial ground that was excavated and developed. I don't know exactly what was developed, but that development later turned into other things. one of the other things being the bar for one. I know the bar that I come in and just had been there for a good 30 plus years is still there to this very day. I don't know, and I can't say if these things still harass an area. I'm friends with a local medicine man from my area, and when I told him about my experiences, he warned me about talking about it, because it will simply draw those negative energies to me, so it's best to not discuss it. The other thing he warned me was those things were trying to scare people off of their land, and they had some connection with the tribes that were there previous to development. He explained that once the burial site was excavated, it stirred up and angered the spirits. I'm a very scientific person, so I take this all with a grain of salt. But I do find it very intriguing, to say the least, especially with the experiences that I've had, my staff has had, and multiple customers have had that defy what we know in modern day science. I can't say those things were demons because they were very much flesh and blood from what I witnessed. New to the area in July 2005, I had been traveling from Crescent City, California over the pass of Highway 199 weekly to Grants Pass, Oregon, and back, and now in the winter of 2006. It was 2 times weekly. My wife had not joined me, and we were separated, and I was attending counseling classes in Medford, Oregon. We had about 5 children, and I had my son living with me, and he was back at home. He was about 13. This particular night, I was delayed on my return from Medford in the evening, usually arriving back in Crescent City around 12:15 a.m. It is roughly an hour from the tunnel to arrive in either Crescent City or Brookings, Oregon, where I live now. I had stopped at the bug station and rested, because I was delayed in my return, sitting with the heater on and the engine idling and doors locked. The little phone booth shack for inspections there now was not there yet. After closing my eyes about 40 minutes, I'm guessing like 12:25 a.m., I was rested and awake to get going back to Crescent City. I use my high beams because it is so dark through there, and everybody does it because, like signaling any opposite traffic of your whereabouts, everyone is usually polite to lower them upon the distance closing. I left the tunnel and traveled down the hill and began the series of S-turns through the pass. It's like a canyon and runs adjacent to various sections of the Smith River. I was slowing through the second S-turn and was watching my headlights and the shadows of the roadside barriers as they were casting the shadows in the trees along the river. My truck was an older Chevy dually with a small diesel, and it was not a powerhouse like the newer ones. I was just cruising with the turns and taking my time. It had a shell with an 8-foot bed, and it was used by a retired couple to tow their trailer, so it was kind of slow. The lights are low to the ground, and when the high beams are on, they go out further and up higher. You can be seen by anyone else, and they can see you from a ways off. As I rounded the turn and was approaching the end of the turn while watching my high beam shadows of the barricade up in the trees, I noticed this big, dark shadow cast in the trees from my lights as I rolled along and my lights lit up a giant creature walking along the opposite side, going against traffic, facing away from me. I said to myself, "Oh shit," and was very excited. The next part of the turn was coming up right away, and I immediately thought to turn around to see its face. I knew it was a Bigfoot and wanted to see its face, but I was too close still to maneuver around and go the other way, and the turn was too shallow. 1,000 things went through my mind. What does he look like? Don't turn around yet. What if he's hostile? He'll beat at my truck. Don't turn around here. The logging trucks fly through there, and my slow diesel would have to do a 3-point turn around or more to possibly get T-boned. I was excited, but also a bit scared. This was amazing. I kept telling myself, not yet. Don't turn around here. I kept looking for spots along the road to turn around, even a little room, because I really wanted to see its face. The mix of it being late, a tight turning canyon, being afraid, and also excited. I was bewildered a little. What do I do? Almost immediately, it was now the small, fast S-turns, very narrow, that lead to the narrow passage. It isn't extremely tight through there, and you could see the tree hanging off the cliff above the roadway in the daytime. And this leads to the resort at Patrick's Creek Lodge. As I passed, I was still shaken up and thought what to do. No one will believe me. As I passed Little Jones Creek, I decided to forget about turning around because, 1, I had already seen it, and 2, it was late and no one would believe me anyhow. I did not have a regular cell phone. It was a cheap Android knockoff due to no reception. A real long startup time when turned on. So here is what I saw and why I am documenting it. It was well over 8 feet tall. I'm 6'2" and played basketball since 4th grade. Even against 7-foot players in high school, I was a leaper and can jump really high. I was 6 foot when I was 12, stopping my growth at 15 years old at 6'2". I could not accurately guess the weight, but well over 400 to 500 pounds, possibly 600, 700, or even 800. He had no neck with a pointed type head buried between his massive shoulders. I'm talking huge shoulders. I was going slow enough through the turn to see his fingers, toes and palms, and foot bottoms as he walked, but his hair was like a llama, matted looking but long and longer, and shorter on different parts of his body. He was light gray to smoky charcoal gray, with some black deeper and beneath his hair, closer to his body. The hair was long on his calves, forearms, hands, and feet, so I just saw tips of long fingers. His feet bottoms were flipping tough. I'll spell it Tuff, because they were wide and what I would describe as padded. He walked swinging his arms down near his knees, but above them and upright, not hunched over like an ape. He was walking, but just massive. Those shoulders. I saw him for a good 3 to 4 seconds. His torso was longer in proportion to his legs. His leg length of thigh to calves was not as long as his upper body. He was huge. I went to work the next day and told a coworker who had lived up here for over 20 years and an avid hunter and fisherman, and he is also part Cherokee, so I knew I could trust him. He has spent countless hours elk hunting and bear hunting. He looked at me kind of silly and sloughed it up, so I shut up. You've only been up here about 8 months and you've already seen a Bigfoot? I know what I saw. After learning more and now hearing them and hearing the term Gigantopithecus, I looked it up and the tropical is the one I saw. Turn the animal around and that is exactly what was walking down the roadway. This is something pretty big that I'm going to tell you about. I know for a fact that the Tulsa Police Department is hiding details about my cousin's death. Before I go any further, I'll tell you a little bit about my cousin. He was a great man, was in his mid-30s, and one of the greatest trackers I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. The man was on point with his craft. He was an avid hunter and knew the outdoors like most people know their own backhand. Tracking was his craft, and that was what he was a master at, and had been since he was just a boy. Him and I were born the same year, and this all happened just in the last few years. Well, he purchased acreage east outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I would visit him frequently through the week since we were close. This particular time I visited, I knew something was wrong. He didn't answer the door like he usually does, so I thought something might be off. I opened his back gate to go see if he was out back, and his wife is rushing up to me, screaming for help and covered in blood. I go into full-blown panic, thinking something seriously wrong happened. She's a blubbering mess, trying to tell me he was attacked by some large gray animal, and she's trying to keep him alive and told my cousin she'd leave to go call 911. I go running to him off in the distance. He's a bloody mess, hardly breathing. When I run up to him, I distinctly remember my stomach churning and wanting to vomit. Both of his legs had been partially torn off his body, twisted and mangled. His left arm was gone and parts of his stomach had been torn open, revealing his intestines and other organs. He hadn't bled out all the way yet, but was oozing fat and blood through his wounds. He looked like he jumped down into a canyon of blackberry bramble. He had deep claw marks and gashes all over him. He looked like he got straight up mauled by a grizzly bear, but worse. I'm surprised he was even still conscious, let alone alive. He couldn't acknowledge or speak to me because he was in shock. The longer I was there trying to keep him alive, screaming at him, talking to him, anything I could do to keep him awake. I started noticing big teeth mark holes in his body, like some large animal was biting and trying to take chunks out of his flesh. It popped into my mind the first time that he had been almost devoured by a bear. Not even 30 seconds later, my cousin took his final breath. Paramedics arrived some 12 minutes later, only to declare him dead on arrival. Officers and many county workers arrived to deal with the incident on hand. His wife and I were escorted off the property to have them deal with the investigation of what happened. Red flags were all over this because you are never escorted off your own property or family's property over something like this that we knew of, so something was going on. His wife and I at first refused to leave, but were threatened with being detained, so we were forced. At first, we thought there was a large bear around, but there were multiple armed officers, people from the county, the sheriff, and other people in uniforms we didn't recognize, all frantically moving around the property and moving my cousin's body out quickly. We weren't given any answers as to what truly happened and told to not talk about it to anybody. The only answers we were sort of given is that there was a bear attack, and that was the end of that. His wife said that what attacked him wasn't a bear. She only faintly saw it. She said she ran out when she heard him screaming and saw this big gray animal on top of him, ripping at him and eating on him. She said it looked nothing like a bear, but it ran away on two legs, had a longer muzzle, and was a silver gray color. When she told me, I didn't know if I could believe her. It seemed so outlandish and crazy. Her tears were so genuine. I couldn't disbelieve her. She saw something maul my cousin and her husband to death. The police kept us from entering the property for almost a week. They had things tapered off and areas where he died you couldn't access. Anyway, I don't know what it is that attacked and killed my cousin, but it was not a bear. A bear doesn't do the damage to his body the way I saw, not like what I saw. I'm very familiar with how bear and grizzly bear kill and eat their prey, even if it is human attacks. This was much worse. This was far more gory. I've been threatened with all sorts of charges and given ample warnings, told not to interfere by lawyers and advisors, but I don't care. I want the truth known about what happened to my cousin, even if that means I'll get charged with impeding on investigations. We were on a long vacation from Missouri in Crescent City, California, staying at the KOA campground. This was our second night at this campground. We were camped at Site 401, way back in the isolated section of the campground, far from anyone. I had just finished cooking our supper on the portable propane barbecue pit, which was located on the picnic table. We both went inside to eat. During the time I was cooking, I set up a campfire but didn't light it yet. After we finished eating, I started the campfire. After the fire was burning for about 15 minutes, I kicked it into the fire pit from the grate. At the time, my wife got a very strong feeling that we were being watched from behind our camper. She said it seemed to move from behind the trailer, from one end to the other. There were trees and dense foliage behind the trailer. I started to look around with a flashlight to see what it was, and after not finding anything, I started the car and plugged in the 12-voltage spotlight. Looking around for about 5 minutes, I thought I saw something move in the distance, behind a tree. This was in the opposite area from the trailer, where no one was camped at all. We were both shaken up and went inside the trailer for the night. After 10 minutes, my wife heard 2 whoops coming from an area that I thought I saw something move at. She was in bed lying next to the window. I didn't hear a sound. One more thing to add. is that the night before we heard the dogs bark in the distance, this night it was all quiet and no dogs at all. The closest camper was about 100 feet away towards the main office. There was no smell. Had a job for a while back where I helped clean up the neighborhood by going through by hand and foot and picking up trash. I did this with the county to help clean things up. One evening, I was working at this large empty plot of land where there had once been a bum camp. Piles of trash and garbage, much of it all over the place due to the wind. I was taking care of it, spending my time making sure I got as much trash as I could. I felt like I was being watched at one point. It's not uncommon for people to notice you, but this felt ominous. When I looked up, about a football field away, watching me from the trees nearby was this very large dark shadow that had glowing eyes. It was up in the tree itself, nestled in thick branches. It appeared to be looking right in my direction. I had a mini heart attack, not knowing what it was, what was spying on me. I don't know if it saw me, but with lightning speed, it jumped down out of the tree and flew off to my right into the thicker woods. It happened so fast that I only caught a glimpse of the general shape. It was tall, dark like a shadow, had larger ears on the top of its head, which looked more like a big dog head. I couldn't make out much detail on the body, other than its large size and that it was upright like a man. It was the last weekend of September, during the fall salmon run of fishing season on the lower Klamath River in 2001. It was the end of summer, and the river was extremely low, and I just finished cleaning my salmon. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I drove up to the river, Blake River's bar. This is where the road ends. We were sitting in my truck with the windows down when we heard a sound that I'd never heard on the river, or anywhere for that matter. My attention was immediately taken so we could hear an extremely deep howling sound that sounded something like a whoa. I was a little freaked out because I have never heard of anything like this. I remember trying to put a body with the sound and not coming up with anything. My friend and I looked at each other and said, "What the hell is that?" The hair was raised on the back of my neck, and I felt very fearful, even though I knew the thing was across the river. We waited and didn't say anything, and within about 3 seconds, we heard the same sound again. This time it went whoa, 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 3 times. It was a very deep, almost like a moaning sound. Immediately after the sound stopped, I heard the same noise, except this one sounded like it was coming up from around the corner, about a half mile, and on the other side of what is called a turrup flat. This one sounded more faint because it was coming up from the other side of the densely wooded area where the river bends. It seemed clear to us that they were calling back and forth to one another. The one on the top of the river called back only twice, and the one across the river sounded off about 4 times. This entire thing only took about 20 seconds, and then it was done. I couldn't really explain what I was thinking or feeling after they stopped, but I was very shaken and just sat there for about 30 seconds, waiting to see if there was going to be any more sounds. I turned my lights on after I thought it was over, and couldn't see anything because the fog was too dense. We were both sure there had never heard any animal like this before. Between the two of us having about 60 years of night fishing and hunting in this area, this was a first. We both talked about it and felt whatever it was that they could have come from either side of the river, because the river was so low that it would have been easy to wade across there, and there wasn't little traffic in the area. The river was also very warm, and it was also full of 30 to 50 pound salmon that were heading up the river. It was a great time to fish, if that is what they were doing. My friend, who lives in Durango, Colorado, told me he just recently had to sell his cabin because of a traumatic experience that happened to him. He's a tough dude, more than a lot of men out there. He doesn't really get scared too easily. and had this family cabin out in Durango, partially in the woods. He was staying there with himself and 2 dogs one night when this large wolf creature broke into the house, killed and ate one of his dogs entirely, and tried to come after my friend. My friend put a few good rounds in him before it fled the cabin. He tried chasing it and tracking it down to kill it, but he couldn't find it. This thing broke off the sliding glass door that was attached to his cabin. I guess it was pretty bad. He doesn't really like talking about it. It used to belong to his father. His father passed it on to him when he died years and years back. He's now looking to pass ownership off to somebody else in his family because of what happened. I am a 54-year-old man living in San Francisco. I have never had any interest in this subject until this week. An old friend of mine moved to Gold Beach, Oregon, and I was driving up to see him. I had never been on Highway 101 before and became nervous driving on the 2-lane winding roads. I kept pulling over to let cars in back of me pass. At about 20 miles or so before Crescent City, I pulled off to allow cars go by. As I went to pull back onto Highway 101, I heard the most horrifying scream that I have ever heard. I screamed myself and ducked down on my seat. Looking up next to my Honda CR-V was a filthy-looking gorilla, the best that is I can describe it. It instantly ran into the tree line a few feet away and vanished into the dense brush. I saw it for maybe 3 or 4 seconds at a 3/4 profile. I would say it was 6.6 feet to 7 feet high, with a wedged head, and it had very dirty matted dark brown dull hair. Strangely enough, seeing the thing didn't frighten me, but the scream it gave out only a few feet from my open window almost gave me a heart attack. I never heard a noise like that, and I never want to hear it again. My Uncle Sal used to live in northern New York State, where he lived there his whole life. He passed away in 2004, but will always be remembered as one of my favorite uncles. He died of kidney failure and was an all-around great human being. My Uncle Sal was a huge stoner, though. So much so that back in the 80s and 90s, he had a small grow-op going on in his backyard. I think anywhere between 12 to 20 plants growing at all times. I couldn't give you the dimensions of his garden, but when the plants started flowering, you could really smell it. There was no hiding it. Luckily for Sal, though, both his neighbors on both sides were cool with it and didn't care. His neighbors were also not right up his butt. They were spaced out a little. They had some privacy. They had woods that went on for miles beyond their backyards, and the front was a main road that led more into the neighborhood. My uncle told me that sometimes at night he would hear this gurgling sound outside, accompanied by heavy thudding. He thought somebody was breaking into his backyard to steal his plants or to sabotage his garden. He runs out there for the first time and sees this monster, as he described it, walking on 2 legs, looking like some dog wolf on steroids, ripping his plants out of the ground and taking them. He gets a good couple shots off on one, and it runs away, taking his plant. He said the smell of wet dog and rotting meat was so powerful, it overpowered the smell of pot. To quote my uncle, "I had a fucking werewolf in my backyard stealing my pot." He never seemed as terrified that he was dealing with a creature like he was, just angry that it was coming at his plants. Sal's next door neighbor was actually half native and always had lots of native family over. He was closer with my uncle. They were around the same age and they spent quite a bit of time together, I guess. He soon learned about this large werewolf-like creature getting into my uncle's backyard. He tells my uncle that the creature is actually called what was it? Something I can't quite remember what he called it. Anyway, their tribe did have a name for it. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, he explained to Sal that because those plants produce a thick odor, they almost repel these things and they don't like it. It must have done more than repel, because this thing was breaking into his backyard and ripping out his plants. That's not repelling, that's just agitation. My uncle would sleep out there at night sometimes, in a lawn chair, with a gun on his lap, waiting for this thing to make its move. My uncle was crazy, and I don't recall him telling me any more encounters he had with this werewolf creature after that particular time, although I'm sure he did. Maybe it was short-lived. I do remember him telling me, though, that once those plants matured and harvested, he transplanted everything to an inside grow room to not deal with the issue anymore. As a young person, I vaguely remember hearing something about a creature called Bigfoot. I suppose I thought he was something the Indians had conjured up. That is how others seem to think. Then, approximately 8 years ago, my sister gave me a book to read during a visit to Florida. I think it was called Mysteries of the Unexplained. I found it to be an interesting book, especially the story about a creature called Bigfoot. I don't remember the details, however, I do remember thinking that there is much more to this so-called myth than meets the eye. Sometime later, I saw the famous Patterson film, a film of a large, heavy, hairy, bipedal subject quickly walking away from a startled cameraman and his horse. My curiosity at this point had me wanting to find out for myself what the truth was exactly. Was this creature real, or just a never-ending series of hoaxes and grossly exaggerated stories? I was in no position at the time to set out on an expedition, so I promised myself and a few close friends that someday I would head to the northwest corner of the United States, the reported home of this creature, and answer the question for myself. Years later, the opportunity finally presented itself. I started purchasing enough supplies for a 30-day solo expedition into the Northwest. Having recently read 3 books on the subject of Bigfoot, I thought my best bets were either Washington State, Oregon, Northern California, or Idaho. Sightings were consistent in and around large forests of these states. While purchasing supplies, I picked up the August issue of a camping magazine that, as it turned out, contained an article about backpacking in Northern California. The article stated that you are more likely to see Bigfoot in the forest of this region than another human being. I took the article seriously. Northern Cali, here I come. At this point, I had read enough material to have a plan that I was confident would bring me face to face with one of these creatures. My plan was to not go after one. It was to give one the opportunity to come to me. I just had to put myself in its backyard. As I made my way into the northwest corner of the state, I realized I wasn't going in for a casual stroll through a forest. This forest was thick with undergrowth and either going almost straight up or straight down. 1 week into my hike into the backcountry, I decided to change my plan. After reflecting on conversations I'd had with the locals, I decided to turn around and head for an area about 25 miles from where I was now standing. The people that had talked openly with me about Bigfoot activity all mentioned geographical locations that were in the same general vicinity. They also said that there hadn't been any activity there in the past 10 or so years. After making my way to this new location, I met a man that had lived there for the past 30 years. He said pretty much the same thing everybody else said. I had come to the right place, but I was about 10 years too late. He then pointed to a spot on my map that, the best of his recollection, was an area with many footprints and supposed sightings that had been reported over a decade ago. That would be my final destination. At this point, my feeling that a Bigfoot was no longer in this immediate area was growing somewhat stronger. I considered the possibility that Bigfoots had lived here at one time and now lived elsewhere due to the logging activity in this valley some 10 to 30 years ago. The forests of this area are large enough to play hide and seek with the entire United States Army. Dense forest covers the land further than the eyes can see, and these creatures could be anywhere in it. I pressed on. As I made my way toward my final destination, I continued to look for signs of something big and heavy, leaving some kind of marks on the earth. If they were still around, I should find something. I came across what looks like a bedding area for a creature that could fit a Bigfoot's description. It was a bowl-like depression in the ground, about 8 feet in diameter. Everything within this circle was flattened. It was only 15 feet from a stream. Convenient, I thought. There was also what looked like a large print on the side of this bowl, headed toward the water. Many small to medium-sized trees in the immediate vicinity were bent over or broken off at the base. It all fit, but it could be a bear's resting place, I thought. I left without bothering to take a picture. The same day, I followed an old logging road to a point that it turned into a poor excuse for a rabbit trail. Along the way, I found 3 depressions, about 14 inches long and 7 inches wide, in the soft, mossy-like growth between 2 old fallen trees. It appeared to be 3 steps taken by a very large and heavy bipedal animal. Coincidence, I thought, and pushed on. By this time on my trip, I had seen several bear, a couple of deer, and 2 mountain. Their tracks were all over the place, especially bear tracks. Bear excrement was also in great abundance. This put me at ease. The better they were eating, the less they would be interested in what I was eating. Blackberries are abundant in August, and from the looks of the scat, it appeared the bears were taking full advantage of this. Visibility was about 10 to 50 yards through the trees. Some of the noises that had been around me on a regular basis were bear and deer that I could not see because of the poor visibility. At the start of this expedition, I would reach for the pepper spray at the mere sound of a couple squirrels playing in the leaves. This behavior was probably due to the fact that a bear had wanted to join me for dinner the very first evening I was in the bush. I'll never forget the sound of him coming towards me through the forest. From that point forward, I was well aware that I was carrying approximately 40 pounds of bear bait, 30-day food supply, on my back. As my time in the woods progressed, so did my ability to guess what animals were around me by the sounds they made in the brush. Given the opportunity, my eyes would usually confirm what my ears had told me. Since I was on foot, and usually on a logging road, I sometimes got extremely close to animals before they realized I was there. One time I had walked within 35 feet of 2 bear, not on purpose, that were feeding off to the side of the logging road. They never heard, saw, or smelt me. Anyway, I reached my destination and made camp at the intersection of 4 logging roads. It was now almost 2 weeks into my expedition. My plan was to recon the 3 logging roads that led down to a river. If I could get to the river, I might find some nice fresh Bigfoot tracks in the sandy banks along the water's edge. I checked out the east road that evening. No luck. It dead-ended about a quarter mile from the river, just like the forestry map showed. I went back to camp, ate dinner, set out a chem light, and hit the tent. I put the chem light out in hopes of deterring bear from casually strolling into my little area of operation. The night passed without incident. I slept like a log. How appropriate. The next morning I checked out the north road. Success. It led right down to a nice open field next to the river. The map I was given by the National Forest Service showed it to be dead-end about half a mile short. I'm glad I checked it out. I thoroughly checked the southern bank of the river. No tracks. The northern bank was covered with heavy growth, and therefore I did not plan on crossing to check it out. No tracks, and I was sure this was the place that had stirred up much of the controversy some 10 to 30 years ago. As I stood in the field and looked back towards the forest, I decided to check all around the field. I started at the west end. Almost immediately after starting this new search pattern, I came across a depression similar to the ones I had recently seen but didn't pay too much attention to. Again, there was no detail because of the type of ground. It was a bigger and deeper depression than I thought a man or bear could ever make. I looked further, and there was one other one, and then another. This time, I was sure these were tracks because there were about 7 of them strung together in the pattern of a natural bipedal walk. I walked in the tracks. The bottom of the depressions were very hard, as though something of great weight had made them last time this ground was wet. The distance between the steps was not extraordinary, at an average of about 3 feet apart. I lost the track momentarily over hard ground and then found it again. It was a consistent track. I figured I was tracking him. I say him when all actuality it may be a her. The opposite direction he was walking, judging from the shape of the tracks. It was now time for something to happen that I had never considered or read about in any book. I followed the tracks through a soft section of ground to the base of a 50-foot tall pine tree. At the base of the pine tree was an area of ground that looked as though it had been trampled down repeatedly by this same heavy creature. It was at that very instant that I realized he had been leaning against a tree. Then it occurred to me that if he was leaning against this bark and sap-covered tree, there must be hair stuck to it. I moved my face closer, and there it was. From a level of about 3 to 6 feet off the ground, hair was stuck in crevices and tree sap. I collected some samples and then stood in the same place that this creature had stood, with my back against a tree. I couldn't help but notice the nice view of the open field next to the river he might have enjoyed while standing in that position. The surface of my back from my buttocks to the area between my shoulder blades naturally was against the tree. If this creature did not put his head against the tree, as I did not do, then I guessed that I was about 2 feet shorter than the Bigfoot that had rested against this tree. I am 5'10". After collecting the hair samples from the tree, I continued to track. I had only gone another 20 yards when I found a similar trampled down area at the base of another pine. This pine, however, was much younger, and the top had been broken off at a height of about 6 feet. The top was lying off to the side. As I looked closer, I noticed that all of the branches on the side of the tree directly over the trampled down area were either bent back and to the side or broken off entirely. Hair was all over this tree as well. This creature wasn't really resting against the tree. He was scratching his back. I continued the track and only gone about another 15 or so feet when I found another young pine that was in the same condition as the one I had just inspected. The top had been broken off at about 6 foot level also. More broken and bent branches, with the telltale hair stuck in the bark and sap. This creature had a definite itch. Since I was tracking him backwards, I guessed that he must have tried to rid himself of this itch on the 2 small trees. They probably weren't sturdy enough to satisfy him, so he made his way over to the large pine and finished the job. The tops of the small pines that I found lying on the ground still had a small percentage of green needles, with the majority looking brown and dying. I don't know enough about trees to make an educated guess as to how long the tops had been broken off. I ventured to guess that it was no longer than a month before I stood in the very same spot. Wow, he had been through here quite recently, I thought to myself. For some reason, I thought he had just been passing through and was no longer in the area. He had been here, but was long gone into another valley. Looking back, I am not quite sure I didn't think he was still around. Maybe it was because I wasn't finding any fresh tracks. I continued tracking him for another 300 yards or so. He was about as hard to track as an elephant through a cornfield. The tracks led to the edge of a thick forest undergrowth, at which point I decided to terminate my efforts. Looking back over the area I had tracked, I realized he had stayed just inside the edge of the woodline the whole way. A smart Bigfoot, I thought. Unlike the bear and deer that were leaving their tracks all over the place in the wide open field. As I started to circle back around the east of this large open field next to the river, I come upon a large pile of excrement. It looked human except for the fact it was a very large pile, and the contents were plant-like. As I mentioned earlier, I had seen a lot of bear dung, and this looked quite different. Tracks led up to and then appeared to straddle this dropping. Again, this was not best ground for holding a track. However, it did look as though the tracks were made by a large, heavy, bipedal Bigfoot. I collected a large sample of the excrement and put it in a plastic baggie. At this point, I was feeling pretty good about what I had found and satisfied that this had been a successful expedition, even if I wasn't going to see a Bigfoot. I had hair and excrement samples, good physical evidence that a Bigfoot is still roaming these woods. I looked around some more and found 2 more of the same types of piles, fairly close to the first one. I remember thinking that this must have been his bathroom. He probably would feed at night, get a drink from the river, and then relieve himself here. If this was being done by a Bigfoot, then he seemed to be the creature of habit. By this time, I had been down by the river for a good few hours. I headed back to camp, which was located about 2 miles up the road. After dinner, I decided to go ahead and recon the west road, which was the last logging road I had to check out. It came to a dead end, just as the east road had. As I was making my way back to camp, before the mosquitoes set in, I noticed something I did not see on my way out. On the north side of this old logging road stood a young pine tree that had been topped at a point about 6 feet above the ground. I immediately looked down at the base of the tree and saw what I knew what I would see. The large trampled down area of ground. Those big padded feet had stood right there. I then saw the tracks leading up to the tree, as well as the top of the tree lying on the ground off to the side. This time I closely inspected the broken off top to the tree and found hair stuck on it. Hair most likely from the side of the hand that broke it off. I must add at this point that I was keeping a lookout for claw marks in the tracks and teeth marks on the broken off treetops, which would most likely have been left behind if a bear had done this. I was paying attention to this for not only myself but for the people that would ask me about it later, when this expedition was all done. I had no doubt what was doing this, and it was not a bear. Anyway, I didn't find a trace of either claw or teeth marks. This time I kept the broken part of this little pine with hair intact in the sap and put it in a plastic baggie. It seemed as though this creature had a habit of preparing these small pines for back-scratching posts in an intelligent and consistent manner. I wondered if other Bigfoots did this. I completed my journey back to the tent and realized that the pine I had just collected the samples from was only about 100 yards away. If the other depressions I had seen on the way into this area were indeed tracks, as I thought they could be, then Bigfoot was leaving too much evidence around here to just be passing through. I figured I was camped right smack in the middle of a Bigfoot's backyard. I had gathered about 3 cords of firewood in the course of the day, which I now started using to stoke up a pretty good-sized campfire. The wood burned quickly because of the fact that it was very old and dry. About every 20 minutes or so, I would have to put on another log. This kept the fire at just under the bonfire setting. Darkness fell without incident. No bears, no mountain lion, and no Bigfoots. Wow, if my friends could see me now, Bigfoot bait. Every few minutes or so, I would look up to the west logging road, and then up the east logging road. The north and south avenues of approach were covered by a very heavy brush. I could hear a lizard coming toward me from either of those directions, so I wasn't too concerned about them. Actually, it would have to be a pretty large lizard to be heard over the snap, crackle, and pop of my campfire. I passed some time by sharpening the ends of my walking stick. I got a chuckle out of the fact that my walking stick was about 3 feet longer than the one I had started with. The further away from civilization I got, the softer and the bigger the stick I carried. Everything I had read and heard about Bigfoots told me they were not as aggressive unless shot at. Since I had no gun, that wasn't a problem. However, I did keep the pepper spray ready at all times, just in case. I also tried to stay aware of which direction the breeze was blowing, because into it, the pepper spray had a maximum effective range of only about 2 feet. I continued to look up and down the 2 logging roads. My campsite was surrounded by complete darkness. I looked at my watch. It was 11 p.m. If I didn't see anything by 1 a.m., I would hit the tent for a good night's sleep. A Bigfoot could be miles from here. Time dragged on as I occasionally looked up and down the 2 roads. I was sitting on a short log, set in an upright position at a distance of about 5 feet from the fire. My back was to the fire so that it wouldn't impede my vision as I scanned the surrounding darkness. I looked into the darkness of the west road and then looked into the darkness of the east road. That is when it happened. The hair on my back and neck stood straight up. It was the strongest instinctive reaction I have ever had in my life. I was looking directly into a pair of eyes that were looking directly at me. I didn't move a muscle. It was Bigfoot. There was no doubt in my mind that what I was looking at was not a bear, mountain lion, owl, or deer. His eyes were set wide apart and well above where I knew the ground should be. I didn't take my eyes off them. The Oma, as called by the local Indians, was watching me. Something that I had not spent much time thinking about until right at that moment was now a prime concern to me. Had anyone ever taken a shot at this creature? Did this creature, for whatever reason, hold any sort of grudge against human beings? I hope not. Actually, it was more like a quick prayer. I did not want him to direct any ill will towards me at all. It most likely would have been about 750 pounds of powerful ill will. He wasn't moving though. I wasn't moving either, even though my neck was crooked to the left in an uncomfortable position. I watched him and he watched me. The longer I looked into his eyes, the more I got the feeling that this was just an intelligent and lonely creature, curious to see what I was doing. I began to relax. I had a mini mag flashlight in my left hand and the pepper spray in my right. I wondered if I should shine the flashlight on him to get a look at his body. Again, I should point out that this could have been a female, but for the sake of simplicity, I will continue to refer to the creature as he. I opted not to shine the flashlight on him, and he came to me. I saw him, and now the ball was back in his court. I waited for him to make the next move. His nocturnal eyes were reflecting the light of the fire I was sitting next to. I tried to make the outline of his body, but I could not. The campfire illuminated bushes and trees out to a certain distance, depending on how recently I had put up a fresh log. Beyond that point of illumination, the forest was pitch black. I believe the fire was at a point that a fresh log had just been added when I first looked up and saw a Bigfoot. I continued to observe. The right eye, his left eye, occasionally seemed to fade in and out as though it was partially blocked by a leaf or branch of the bush I was sure he was standing behind. Earlier at times when I really had the fire going, the front of this bush would be illuminated for the period of time that the fire was brightest. I couldn't see the bush now, but I was sure of its position. As I studied his eyes, I got the impression that they were wet. Liquidy, you might say. An effect probably caused by the flickering of the fire they were reflecting. They were a glossy yellow when I first saw them and faded to a real faint yellow, almost white, toward the end of our strange staring session. Looking back, I would guess that while paying complete attention to him, I had neglected the fire, and as the fire lessened in intensity, so did his eyes. Occasionally, it looked as though he would blink. His eyes would simultaneously disappear for a fraction of a second. It also looked as though his head was shifting from side to side. Similar, I thought, to what I would do if I was trying to observe someone from behind a bush. His eyes looked to be approximately 4.5 to 5 inches apart, and almost 1 inch in diameter. Minutes ticked by, and my neck was beginning to get sore from the position I was sitting and watching him as he watched me. I casually looked at my watch. It was now 12:15 a.m. Then I slowly raised and extended my left arm for the purpose of using my hand as a measuring tool. He didn't move while I did this. He just kept watching. I used the width of my left hand to measure the distance from his eyes to the top of a lone pine silhouette against the night sky in the background. I made a mental note that his eyes were almost directly under and 2 hand widths below the tip of the lone pine. I also made a mental note not to move the log I was sitting on for the rest of the night. I would use this information when the sun came back up. After making these observations, I decided to relieve the soreness in my neck and look up at him from another position. I slowly spun around in one direction away from him. I didn't want him to think I was getting ready to confront him. I looked up and he was still there watching me. I remember wondering if he could tell I was watching him. The fire was now slightly behind and to the left of me. From his vantage point, I was most likely now just a silhouette by the fire. His eyes were now getting harder to see. They were there, but not as bright. My eyes were getting sore from staring, and then I noticed how dark it was getting in my camp. The fire had barely a flame left to flicker. It didn't take me long to decide that I wasn't going to sit there in complete darkness with a Bigfoot just spitting distance away. I slowly stood up to get another log from the pile that was just out of reach. I positioned the log in the fire and sat back down. When I looked up, I could not find his eyes. He was gone. At about 3:15 a.m., I thought I could see his eyes again, but in a position further back from where he had stood the first time. I was kind of expecting him to come back and see what I was up to. It was hard to tell if he did or not, but I think he did. Time passed slowly as I waited for the sun to come up so I could check for tracks. I thought about doing it with a flashlight, but rejected the idea. I would see things much more clearly in the morning. As the sun came up, I sat in the same position I was in when I had measured his eyes from the top of that lone pine tree. According to how everything lined up, his eyes would have been centered at the top of the 8-foot bush that stood about 70 feet away from where I had been sitting. When it was light enough to see the ground fairly well, I made my way over to the area behind the bush. It was an area that was just to the side of the logging road. The ground was similar to the logging road itself, which was hard-packed gravel. The difference was that the area where I figured a Bigfoot should have been standing was covered in a dry, sparse, wheat type of grass. There they were, the same size tracks I had been finding all along. The tracks were not much more than the grass being squashed, and I do mean flattened in the shape of a big, padded foot, narrower at one end than the other, and approximately 16 inches long and 7 to 8 inches wide at the front of the track. There was a set of tracks leading to a point exactly behind the bush, where they then became less distinguishable, as though he had been shuffling around. There was, however, one depression in the ground at a point close to the bush. I guess it would have been his right foot that made it by its shape. I stood there where it looked as though he had stood and found myself directly behind the bush. I looked up to see that it was about 2 feet taller than my eyes would have been at bush top level. There was another set of tracks that led away at a slightly different angle than the set that had led in. He had come in and left on the east logging road, nice and quiet. No crashing through the forest. At this point, I thought to look for a hair sample around the tracks in hopes of later matching it with the samples I already had. I got down on my stomach and looked. Nothing. I quickly looked over the logging road for more tracks, but didn't find anything. It was very hard-packed. Decision time. Do I stay camped here and hope to see a Bigfoot in the daytime? This is when I realized I had taken too many pictures the day before, and I did not have any more film for the camera. Last time that ever happens. Anyway, Bigfoot is nocturnal, and daytime sightings are extremely rare. He would have probably be somewhere very well hidden and fast asleep during daytime hours. As I mentioned earlier, my plan was to stay 30 days in the bush. But now that I had the hair, excrement, and tree samples as well as the pictures of the tracks and the experience of last night, I decided 2 weeks was long enough. I packed everything up and headed out on the east logging road. I was walking at a pretty good pace, having 17 miles to cover before nightfall, with about 60 pounds worth of gear still in my rucksack. I didn't want to waste any time. I'd only gotten about 75 yards up the logging road when I heard what sounded like an extremely large animal thrashing in the woods at a point next to where I was walking. The noise was so close that I didn't even think I was going to get the pepper spray in time I wore on my left arm out of its holder in time to use it. Then I realized it was running away from me, crashing through the woods. I think best describes it. Large branches snapping as it escaped my nearness. As I listened to its escape, I tried to figure out what it was. It covered a lot of ground very, very quickly. Through the process of elimination, I started guessing. The list of possibilities was short because There are not many animals large enough to have possibly made that much noise. The speed suggested a deer, but there was no snorting or hoof sounds that I had previously heard from deer running away from me, nor did the animal in question sound as fleet-footed as a deer. The feet were crunching, a lot of material underneath them, suggesting that they were large surface extremities. Could it have been a bear? Possibly, but all the bear I had dealt with to this point were not that afraid of anything. The creature in question was also running away from me on the downhill side of the road, and it is my understanding that bear don't run downhill too well. Things happened very quickly, which made it hard to tell, but it also sounded as though the creature I had heard was not getting away from me, but in a four-legged gallop. There is one thing I am sure of. The noise I had heard was caused by an extremely large and powerful creature that desperately did not want to be that close to me. I will venture to guess that my old buddy had stayed pretty close to me the whole night, and may have even been watching me for the next morning. I call him that because I felt as though we had somehow bonded during my long look into his eyes that night by the campfire. I had seen his soul, and it was a kind soul. My question had been answered. This was in July of 1997,